Hello, and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
Cameron, we got a lot of feedback on the episode that we did on fiction and fantasy, or fantasy more specifically. And so if you're just joining us in this conversation, you might want to go back and listen to that episode before you listen to this one. But a whole bunch of things came up out of that, questions that people have of kind of why this and not this, what's okay from a Christian perspective and what isn't. And then specifically, people had questions about the fact that you often are speaking on behalf of like horror as a genre that has deep practical spiritual implications, but then you also speak about some forms of fiction or fantasy that you say are out of bounds. And I think I can guess where you're going to go in that, but I think that'd be a great conversation to lead in on how you differentiate in those categories. But then, and this will be for everybody, I think Cameron's going to have some challenging words for us to think about the consistency of what we deem to be okay in which categories of what kinds of content, and where Christians turn a blind eye to some things and then act like they're offended in other categories. And so I'm sure there's opportunity for us to all have our toes stepped on here. So, Cameron, take it away.
All right. Well, let's start with horror for just a second, because I think that's a very fair question. I think some people may have wondered, oh, Cameron doesn't watch Game of Thrones, but he's perfectly happy to watch horror films. So what's up with that? I think that's more than fair. So let me say a few words about what horror actually is. Let's get a definition, because that's important. So horror is a little bit like tragedy's Gothic cousin. And I'm going to use Aristotle's definition of tragedy because why not? That clears it up, doesn't it? So in the Poetics, Aristotle defines tragedy famously as a serious imitation of life that evokes pity and fear. So that's what tragedy is. It's a genre that evokes pity and fear, those emotions. Aristotle's supreme example is Sophocles' version of Oedipus the King. All right. Not the most uplifting story if you've ever read it, but most people would say it is by wide consensus a great work of art. Very noble, very powerful. Another one would be King Lear by Shakespeare. So tragedy falls into the category of something that is not for everybody, right? There are many people who love tragedy. And in fact, tragedy, we're going to see horror does the same thing. Tragedy brings up a very interesting question that we have been wrestling with since ancient times, and nobody has really resolved it. And it's why does tragedy give pleasure? The emotions of pity and fear are not pleasant. And usually, tragedy ends on a note of despair. King Lear is total despair. So why do people enjoy that? Are they just sadistic and masochistic? Well, most people I know who like tragedy, Nathan, are not sadistic or masochistic people. They're nice, normal people. Many of them professors of literature, right? But it is an interesting question. And I'll say a little bit more about it in a second, but I'm not sure that there's a way to fully resolve it. I think there are some answers there. But horror is like that. Horror is a genre, but the emotions are a bit different. They're similar. So with horror, the two main emotions of horror as a genre are fear and disgust. So tragedy is pity and fear. Horror is fear and disgust. So, and it brings up the same question. Why do people like this stuff? I think it's worth also pointing out that the history. So I want to bring in a little bit of the history of horror. Horror is a new genre, and I think that makes it really interesting. So in that sense, it's in a similar category as something like science fiction. Science fiction is a relatively new genre. It's easy to say why science fiction is, that gets complicated. In one sense, science fiction is new. Science fiction as we know it. Science fiction in terms of speculative fiction, alternative realities, that's more ancient, right? But science fiction as we think of it, Blade Runner and things, and, Starship Troopers. I'm talking about Robert Heinlein's novel, not the ridiculous movie. But that's dependent on technology. So it makes sense that that's newer. Why is horror around now? I think that's a really interesting question. And you're going to have to just take it with a grain of salt because this is Cameron's little grand theory. but horror shows up. There's debate on when exactly it shows up or what exactly constitutes the first horror story. Generally, there is scholarly consensus that it begins with the English Gothic novel. And whether it's Horace Walpole or, whether, we don't know, there's not agreement on who the first one was, but that's where it starts. But what's interesting is it emerges around the same time as the Romantic movement. And the Romantic movement was a response, among other things, to the depredations of the Industrial Revolution. It was very much a moral movement. It was very much about, a return to nature and the natural realm. Think about Wordsworth and Coleridge and some of their ballads that were all about this, or, Tintern Abbey. But horror is kind of like the shadow side of that. So horror also emerges, and Nathan, I suspect you'll find this interesting, at a time when Darwinism is displacing the traditional view of the universe and the place of human beings in the universe. So one of the things that horror does really well is it gets us to take evil seriously. And when human beings are
Yeah. Okay. So
displaced and the
hang on. Let me
universe
jump
is,
in.
well,
Let me jump.
yeah, I'll
Let me
hang on
jump
here
in
for a
here.
second. Yeah.
Yeah. Hang on a second here, because this is the thought that's running through my mind, is that for the vast
Mm.
majority of human history, we have not needed an art form to remind us that evil is real.
Yes,
Horror.
exactly, Nathan. You got it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep, you got it.
Because all of human. So you
You
say
got it.
horror
That's exactly
is a
what I was
new.
gonna say. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that great minds go down rabbit trails together. Carry on.
Well, and that's not really a rabbit trail. That's central. That's what I think is the case. Because yes, so do you have horrific imagery in the ancient world? Well, yeah, of course. You've got the underworld, but the point you just made is the right one. Evil is assumed. Everybody knows it's real. There's no case that needs to be made for evil. So the two greatest horror tales, I think, are Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The subtitle is Or the Modern Prometheus, which is that dramatizes human arrogance, ambition, trying to play God. But the other one is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. And that one is all about human depravity and what happens when we think that we can gain the upper hand there ourselves and gain control of the darkness in our hearts. So those are both profoundly moral tales. They're dark, they're unpleasant, and it's true. Well, no, I mean they actually, both of those are filled with what we would, I mean, I use the word traditional horror imagery, raiding, grave robbing, the living dead, things like that. Robert Louis Stevenson is careful he doesn't actually talk about, it's clear Hyde commits murders, but it's also clear that he does things that are very perverse and sadistic. He doesn't describe any of them. And I appreciate that because he doesn't need to. He leaves that to our imagination. And it's worth pointing out that a lot of horror films do not leave anything to our imaginations. And
Okay.
I
So
don't think that's
so
good.
to bring
Yeah.
this back around a second, compare that then to Game of Thrones.
So I think the question here, I'm going to bring in a word I'm just going to bring in the word gratuitous. Yeah, I think it's an important word. And I think we need to consider also some marketing categories. It's going to sound strange to say that, but the fact that Game of Thrones is an HBO series is a salient factor here. We have now lots of, we've had access to internal memos and we have data on this, but there's a lot of pressure in HBO leadership, among HBO leadership, on showrunners to include, for instance, graphic sex in the shows, because that's part of HBO's brand. Did you know that, Nathan?
I think,
yeah.
Even if you didn't know that, you could read between the lines.
It's probably not surprising.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can read between the lines. It's not hard to. But yeah, so how does HBO distinguish itself from, the movies that come out in movie theaters? Well, it's got stronger content in it. So that's a factor there. But something is gratuitous when it is excessive. And so a good deal of what you see in Game of Thrones, but in a lot of movies, and by the way, there's this weird thing that happens if you happen to be a fan of a certain genre. like a subgenre or a genre like horror, people assume you're being a spokesperson and you like all horror. And I always say I don't like all horror any more than I like all comedies or all action flicks. So I will freely admit there's a lot of horror out there that is trash and absolute and very destructive and ugly and excessive. So absolutely. I totally admit that. But yeah, it's when you have content that crosses a line, and is it possible to draw a clear set in stone line here? No, I don't think it is. I think you're operating in ambiguous territory here. But if you have excessive violence, excessive nudity, yeah, I mean, as a Christian, you can use your discernment. And also, another question, if you want to look at it in narrative terms, is does this really serve the narrative? Or could this be, let's give an old example. This was a very scandalous scene when it came out, but Gone with the Wind, which when that came out, I think that was the 1950s. And the precise year of its release is escaping me. Well, Gone with the Wind had a scene where Scarlett is carried up the stairs, and it is clear that they're going to the bedroom. That image is all that needs to be there. What actually happens in the bedroom is left discreetly to your imagination. And then there's a precedent, of course, in ancient Greece. Nathan, I mentioned Oedipus
Mhm.
Rex. In ancient Greece, the rule of thumb was the violence, the obscenity takes place off stage.
Yeah.
So Oedipus gouges his eyes out off stage. There are some
Mhm.
ancient, there are some old plays that do violate this. Are you familiar with Titus Andronicus?
Nope.
Nathan, you're aware of that? That's a Shakespeare. Yeah. It's a Shakespeare play that's basically a slasher. It's extremely gory. I mean, it really is. It's very bloody and it's very excessive. And for that reason, it's not as well known. But there's a general rule of thumb where you don't want, I don't want gratuitous, self-indulgent, excessive content in what I watch. And horror films, in their best instances, the reason I like horror is because they take evil seriously in ways that most of our other entertainment does not. I mean, if you take a film like John Wick, for instance, where there's just gallons of blood are spilled throughout the movie, there's so much collateral damage, quote unquote, which involves human beings dying. You have a world where it's very hard to take violence seriously because it's so trivialized. Or if you take your average zany comedy, where gross acts of immorality, adultery, murder, dishonesty, theft, I mean, you name it, all of it is trivialized and turned into a joke. So you get this fantasy of a world without any real moral consequences. Horror films give you a very different picture of the world, a world where there is such a thing as true evil, and there may even be
Mhm.
eternal consequences.
Yeah.
So I think
So,
that's
all right,
valuable. And I'm not saying everybody should
let's
watch horror films.
so three things I want to respond to. One is the first one the last thing you just said, that if you're listening to this, Cameron does not believe that everybody should. The second point I'd like to make is, and I can say why a lot of people might not find it to be an interesting art form, and that is if you already believe that evil is real
Mhm.
and you're aware of horrendous, heinous things happening in the world around you and the
Sure.
trauma and the bloodshed, and you live in the real world where you see all of that, then it might not be relaxing for you to sit down for the evening and enjoy that as an art form. It'd kind of be like a vegetarian continuously watching videos on like how great vegetables are. You're like, yeah, I'm already sold on the concept. Um,
Sure.
I'm not a vegetarian. If anybody's listening, I was just using that as an example of saying, um, I think that might be the background, Cameron, of why some Christians would say, "Why is this necessary?" And you would respond, I'm guessing,
Mhm.
saying, "It isn't for the Christian, but you have to see the apologetic value
Mhm.
for the people who don't believe that evil is real. That's the crossover." Um, so there's that, and then
Mhm. Correct.
thirdly, and this is where we might want to turn the direction of the conversation a little bit, is you said that
Yep.
horror traffics in the categories of fear and disgust. And maybe if there's an expert on
Mhm.
disgust in our modern era, it's Jonathan Haidt. His name is well known in a lot of circles, but
Right.
his I'm pretty sure his PhD was on concepts of disgust. And in fact, if you look at his book, The Righteous Mind, part of the way that he tracks out the political difference of categories that people fall into have to do with where they find disgust and what they find disgusting.
Hmm.
And therein lies an interesting thing where he would say you're more liberal um, leaning people would see categories of disgust as in like how they treat their bodies. So eating healthy becomes, a response to the disgust of obesity. Whereas more conservative leaning people have stricter categories and concerns of disgust around, say, sexual ethics. And it mirrors all the way down through in a whole number of interesting categories of what people find disgusting then becomes part of the way in which they form their political theories and all sorts of things. All that to say is that the categories of disgust that horror often traffics in would be categories that more frequently align with maybe a a conservative Christian category of disgust as well.
Yeah.
So and I'm not justifying anything. I'm just pointing that out as another reason where well, a lot of Christians would be like, "What? This is disgusting in a not helpful or interesting way," and I already find it
Yeah, and that
disgusting.
is
Go
and that
ahead.
is not lost on secular critics, by the way, and secular academics. There's a lot of ink has been spilled on especially horror films that came out in the Reagan era, for instance, and what happens to people, for instance, take a typical in the slasher subgenre. It's basically in these movies, there's a rule of thumb. If you have sex, you've just signed a death sentence,
Mhm.
and now
You're gonna die.
that's that's not a healthy yeah, right. That's not a healthy expression. That's a very crude expression of, morality, if you even want to call it that. And I'm not a big fan of those films, but this has not escaped a lot of people. Yeah.
So then let's turn the
But
corner here
here's
though, because
yeah.
I think what
Hmm.
you will hopefully challenge a lot of us to think through is to say, what is forming your categories of disgust? Because
Hmm.
if you
Yeah.
have a if you have a New Testament Christian vision of right and wrong, there's a
Hmm.
lot of stuff in other categories that aren't horror that I think you would use the phrase "get a free pass"
Right.
in the Christian viewing mind. So run us down this prong of the journey.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's leave horror behind right now and just expand this to fiction as a category, because I think in particular, we Protestants, we have a real heritage of suspicion when it comes to fiction. And we trace this all the way back to our Puritan forebears who saw fiction, some of whom saw fiction as immoral because it was a lie. And we may think we've outgrown that, but I don't think we have. Catholics don't. It's interesting that Catholics don't struggle with this the way that we do, and especially the way you'll notice that we, for instance, the Catholic Church has a very rich tradition of great modern writers of recent years, and continues to this day. There are great Catholic writers now who are writing literature, right? It's not just Flannery O'Connor and Graham Greene and Walker Percy. There are people now, Ron Hansen and others, who are contemporary Catholic writers who continue that on. It's pretty hard to point to anybody of that caliber in the evangelical camp.
Hmm.
Where are they? Where are our great writers? Why don't we have a Flannery O'Connor? We don't, and we really don't. Well, part of it, I think, has to do, that's a complicated question, but part of it has to do with an abiding suspicion about fiction as not being truthful. So that might sound untrue to you. So let me just break that down a little bit and try to illustrate it for you. And I hope to show you that this actually is the case. So think about what shows up in, Lifeway bookstores are closed down quite a lot. And I mean, a lot of Christian bookstores, sadly, are shuttering their doors. But just think about what kind of books are on the shelf when you walk into a Christian bookstore. Okay. They generally are going to be sanitized books. You know that. They are safe books. What does that mean? It means that they don't have F words in them. It means that they don't have any explicit sex scenes in them. And it means that it probably don't have a whole lot of violence in them. Although violence, we're a little bit more okay with violence in evangelical circles. I'll say more about that in a second. We're cool with violence. We're not cool with sex in our fiction. So this is why marketing categories are important here. So if something is marketed as Christian fiction, it's almost like there's a sort of invisible guarantee. It's kind of like an Oprah book club stamp on the book telling you that maybe that this is probably not going to go beyond a PG-13 in its content. So a philosopher pointed out once that theologically conservative Christians, when it comes to the true, the good, and the beautiful, sometimes have a tendency, especially in the arts, to try to focus only on the good and the beautiful to the exclusion of truth. And what he's getting at is that, so think about a piece of art from Thomas Kincaid. What's
I knew
interesting
it.
here is
That
to
checks my bingo
take
card
into,
of what you're going to say.
yeah, there you go. But I'm bringing him up actually not because of his paintings, which are, he's a very skillful painter, but come on, this is Lisa Frank for grown-ups. It's very, it's a very sentimentalized vision of reality. The interesting factor about that, though, is the reason I want to bring him up is because of the tragic circumstances of his own life. Are you familiar with that, Nathan?
No, I'm not.
Yeah. So there's a really good piece in the Wall Street Journal that was written years ago by Gregory Wolfe when Thomas Kincaid died. And Gregory Wolfe was the founder of Image Journal, and he's still now he runs a publishing house called Slant Books. So he's very involved in the arts movement, Catholic himself. He wrote a really beautiful and very respectful tribute to Thomas Kincaid, the man. And it's clear that he doesn't like his art. But Thomas Kincaid died an alcoholic. He had a DUI. He was quite young when he died. And so Thomas Kincaid grew up very poor in California. And I guess there was, and Wolfe recounts this story in his Wall Street Journal piece, but that Kincaid and his brother there was this one really, very, very wealthy neighborhood that they would go to. And there's this one beautiful home in particular. And Kincaid would look at it. And this was kind of his Sehnsucht longing moment. He didn't just want he didn't just want wealth. That house represented a refuge. It represented safety and some kind of consolation,
The other side of where he felt he was,
the hardship he had. Right. And so he wanted to paint that. That's what he said. I want to paint that. So I bring that up because I want to say this with compassion. And in art circles, there's a tendency to thumb your nose at evangelical artists who are trying their best and all of that. But there's a genuine longing for goodness and beauty. But we live in a fallen world. Now, that doesn't mean that. So I think there are the two mistakes we can make. One, we can go really sentimental and give a sanitized vision of reality that doesn't actually match reality. It makes people feel safe. It doesn't really push them it doesn't really challenge them. They don't really grow from it. It's more like a kind of escapism. So, I mean, in that sense, kind of Amish romance fiction, it's pretty hard to deny that that's a form of escapism. But on the other hand, you can go too far and give a vision of reality that's so bleak and so dark, it's also exaggerated. And I think HBO,
Right.
a lot of those shows fall into this category. I mean, for goodness sakes, most of the modern series and police procedurals that, get venerated, I mean, we clap them on the back for, they're just so realistic. They tell us how it is. But so everybody's a horrible person in these shows. Everybody's an alcoholic. Everybody's having an affair. Everybody has some horrible skeleton in their closet. And this is supposed to be, but that's not true of life either. It's finding the balance.
Yeah,
Did you want to chime in there real quickly?
Well,
before
yeah, let me. I was making a listening thought pause here, because, I remember having this conversation with my grandpa of him saying that art, you often get kind of two large categories. One is people painting the world the way that they wish it was, and then other people saying, "No, I'm going to paint the world the way that I see it." And he was making a parallel there to the spiritual disciplines, sort of mirror that as well, as far as what we focus on and what we aspire to. and a broader category. But that sense is there, and I think David Foster Wallace makes that case when he's talking about television often, that the fantasies that are projected there are say something about us sociologically because they say something about the way that we want the world to be. Um, it's not trying to describe the world, it's actually telling us the way that we want the world to be. And so when we see the things that unsettle us, it shocks us because we're recognizing that things are produced for us to enjoy seeing them, and therefore the brokenness or the goodness that we see is somebody else's attempt at projecting for us what they think we want to see. um and so, yeah, I think that's the
That's
complex tension
especially
that
true.
art holds us in.
Well, and that yeah, that's right. Well, and that's especially true of most of our favorite comedy shows are like that. They often will portray a world where, you know, basically all of the major assumptions about our of our culture about sexuality and what's right and what's wrong are just embodied in the characters. Carl Truman points out how important a show like Will and Grace was for normalizing homosexuality, because you had these lovable characters who were, both of whom were gay on the show.
Mhm.
And I mean, now you can, the shows with, now you can run this same experiment back with, you can go back to a show like Leave It to Beaver, right? Or 1950s shows, or like the Andy Griffith Show, which embody very much the values of their time as well. But now the progressive values of our own cultural elites come through very loud and clear in most of these shows, everything from Brooklyn Nine-Nine to New Girl. They are, in that sense, they are escapist fantasies that give you that idealized world, and are profoundly comforting. But so I guess, yeah, some serious art, even when it's a portrayal of goodness, so like Gilead, serious art usually has a prophetic edge. I mean, Gilead is not
Mhm.
a sentimental novel. There are things in there that are deeply disturbing, and there's, especially, I would say, that the relationship between Reverend John Ames and the character of Jack, which is something that Robinson herself just can't leave alone. Now we've got her latest book is Jack.
Yeah.
She just
Yeah.
seems to love this prodigal character of hers so much. But he's the snake. He's not a bad. I'm not saying he's a bad person, but I'm saying in terms of this town of Gilead, Jack is the kind of snake in the grass a little bit, because he threatens the sort of order, in particular for the character of Reverend John Ames, who's a good man but has made some very serious mistakes as a human being. Jack is the greatest challenge to his goodness. I mean, to his virtue.
Mhm.
And that's important that's in there. But then you have, so I think, I'll bring in the double standard real quickly, Nathan, and
Yeah,
then
I think
let you riff on
I have
that,
two
because I'd said
directions I'd
that to
like us
you
to go,
earlier.
and that's the first one I'd like us to.
All right, so commence stepping on toes now, Cameron. Here it goes. So the example I like to point to here is Christians, theologically conservative Christians, the type who don't see anything wrong with what's on the shelves in a Christian bookstore. It's such a great alternative to what's on the shelves in Barnes and Noble. Well, a lot of times they like films like Braveheart. So Braveheart, I'm going to single out Braveheart uniquely. Why does Braveheart has savage violence and it has sex in it too? Why does Braveheart get a free pass? And I think, and I'm going to go ahead and say it. Yes, Cameron, who likes horror films, I think Braveheart is excessively violent. I mean, Mel Gibson is an exquisitely gifted filmmaker who loves savage brutality. I mean, if you've seen these other, Apocalypto, my
Passion of the
goodness,
Christ. Yeah.
these films are Passion of the Christ. I mean, yeah, these films are bloodbaths, but it gets a free pass, I think, because it embodies, certain virtues, courage, and a lot of the things that we will venerate are held up in these movies, but it's history, or and it is. This stuff is Braveheart is history, and I think we take history more seriously because it's true, whereas we think fiction is not true. So I think most theologically conservative Christians would find it laughable to go through a book on the Third Reich that sanitized the violence. I think they would find it offensive,
Mhm.
which it would be, right? We don't, I mean, and they would, because they understand the moral gravity of that, what's going on. But if you have a work of fiction where this kind of violence is being portrayed in the story, then people are tempted to think of it as immoral. Why? Well, because it's excessive violence, because it's not true, so it didn't need to be there in the first place. But there are different, fiction gets at truth in a different way. So Lord of the Rings, generally loved and accepted by Christian audiences, theological conservatives among them, right? Lord of the Rings is not factually true, right? Middle Earth, you will not locate that on a map anywhere.
What?
It's not real.
Yeah. Okay.
But most of us, yeah, right. Sorry to disappoint you. But most of us would agree it's filled with truth. It's absolutely overflowing with truth about courage, friendship, and just perseverance. I mean, all those wonderful. There's Lord of the Rings could not be more filled with truth.
Time out.
Yeah,
I'm going to out you here, Cameron.
Okay.
You don't even like Lord of the Rings.
I stepped on your toes.
You don't even like Lord of the Rings. But you're being very charitable here.
I don't.
So I just wanted everybody to know the extent to which Cameron.
I recognize it's great. Well, I recognize its greatness, though. I mean, there's the genius of Lord of the Rings is undeniable. I just personally have never gotten to a place where I enjoy it. Lost the respect of a lot of our listeners right there.
Okay, so I have a theory on. I haven't seen Braveheart, so I don't know what the hype's about. But do you think that
it's a good movie? It's well done.
Yep. That history gets a pass?
Yep.
Or the violence in history, or I'm just trying to walk through a potential in between position here, where reading about history is viewed as descriptive, where some of the violence or categories of fantasy would fall into the prescriptive or glamorizing of the brutality, where in a historical sense, we can look back on it with a deep sense of lament and say, man, our hearts are grieved at the brokenness of the hearts of humans. Whereas you can have something that's making the same point in fiction, but since it didn't really happen, that it always feels like it's justifying it rather than lamenting it. And I'm not saying that all fiction
that's a great question.
glamorizes death, violence, brutality, sex, all that.
Yep. No, I hear what you're saying.
I'm not fishing for an answer here. I'm just wondering if that is subconsciously seen as a categorical difference.
And I'm going to give you what is going to be a disturbing answer on this. Let's start with film. So I think Braveheart I do think Braveheart glamorizes violence. I think that's almost indisputable. I think you have a very strong, very good-looking, very charismatic Mel Gibson playing a very strong, very good-looking character who cuts off a lot of people's heads and is drenched in blood and war paint and looks really cool doing it. It is impossible to convince me that that's not a glamorization of violence. Now,
so
let me contrast that.
I'm with you.
I'm going to name. Yes, I'm now going to name, and I'll get to your prescriptive thing in a second because that's very important. But I'm just trying to illustrate for you films that don't glamorize violence or do so less are way more disturbing. Most of us don't realize it, but we prefer the glamorized vision because it's slightly sanitized. So I'm going to name two movies that I am not recommending, and I actually can't say strongly enough. Probably, I would say don't watch these films unless you're doing some kind of a study or you're But morbid curiosity should not push you to watch these films. But one is Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. The other one is Snowdown Murders. Okay, so both of these are films that take true stories of serial killers who were not Hannibal Lecter. They weren't some brilliant super genius, right? I think Silence of the Lambs, this is going to sound strange, Silence of the Lambs still looks like fantasy to me because Hannibal Lecter is a character who's not really that believable. He looks almost like Darth Vader to me. We like these really exotic serial killers like Dexter and all of that. In these stories, these killers are not brilliant, charismatic people. They're actually idiots who are empty and hollow inside and are just purely selfish, and they kill people. And the violence is not stylish. It's not glamorized. What it is incredibly ugly, incredibly empty, and it will leave you feeling dirty and defiled. But it's way closer to reality. That's way closer to the actual senseless violence that takes place. And so I'm just pointing that out to say that our modern sensibilities are so predisposed to prefer stylized versions and glamorized versions of reality.
Well,
And
hang on.
when movies
So
do it, it's yeah,
yeah, well, here's maybe another feature of this though is one of the things that violence in modern films does is you always get the setup in the beginning of somebody doing something so atrocious and unjust that everything else that happens to them in the rest of the
mm,
film is justified. And so the hero is
yeah, right, yeah,
justified
hmm
in their use of violence because they're writing this, existential, they're
hmm
fighting on behalf of the good of the universe or um the
yeah,
virtue
they're
of
paying them
the
back.
it's yeah, whereas in the types of films it sounds like you're describing, there isn't a this guy's going and killing this person because that person caused some great moral infringement. They're just doing it because they're
Right.
messed up. And so
No, they're
that's an interesting one for
yeah,
me to watch because that becomes part of the reason of why people justify the violence, even from a Christian perspective, which does not fit within your Christian theology of when and why it's
no,
okay
not at all.
to glamorize and glorify, glamorize the violence. They're like, well, he had it coming. Clearly, he needed to be, so anyway, that would be a distinction I would
Oh,
see in some of that as well.
it's a very important. Well, even superhero films, a lot of these films, superhero films included, have scenes of torture in them. For instance, and it's hard to overstate just how misunderstood torture is in movies. But I will tell you that some of the few films that get it right, in terms of how defiling it is, not only for especially for the perpetrators. Now, we would say this, we're virtue ethicist guys, but what it does to the
Yeah,
person doing it.
yeah. Hmm.
The films that, but again, films that explore this are exceedingly unpleasant to watch. They're not fun. They're ugly, and I mean, truly prophetic films are something else entirely. It's one thing to read it because you use your own imagination. You can put the book down. A film is a visual assault, so it's in a there's a whole different degree of intensity there. So, and that's why films like that are not very popular, by the way. Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer was not a blockbuster, as you might imagine. But
Hmm.
did it have some important moral points to make? I think it did. Do I think everybody should watch it? By no means do I think that at all. But I think it could do some good sometimes with certain people who have been, say, desensitized or are totally. I mean, some filmmakers have a real problem with casual depictions of violence. And there's an Austrian filmmaker, Michael Haneke, for instance. He made a movie called Funny Games. Again, just absolutely horrendous film. And I wouldn't, but part of what he was doing was pushing against this kind of Tom and Jerry approach to human beings being murdered. And
Hmm.
so he made a film that was very polarizing. But so let me real quickly, because we're running into some length here. But let me just say something about the prescriptive question you asked, because that's a really, I think that's an important one. So if we're talking about fiction, and genre is important here, let's talk about a work of that's more realist in the sense that it's not in a fantasy world or a speculative world. Let's take Flannery O'Connor, for instance. So Flannery
Hmm.
O'Connor, a lot of people, I mean, she's one of my favorite writers. A lot of people get scared off of her because the first story that they read is usually A Good Man is Hard to Find. That's the one that's always anthologized, and so spoiler alert, this story involves the systematic execution of an entire family, including children and grandma, by a serial killer named the Misfit. All right, so not very pleasant. It's a spiritually radiant story, and most of her stories involve copious amounts of bloodshed and lots of unpleasantries. And she caught a lot of flack for that. There's a new movie coming out about her that Ethan Hawke made, and Maya Hawke, his daughter, plays Flannery O'Connor. It's called Wildcat. That's going to explore some of that. It looks really good, by the way. But she was so was when she's writing these stories, is she trying to glorify violence? No. What
No.
she was trying to do is what her stated aim was. She was trying to portray grace the radical nature of God's grace in everyday circumstances that involve a fallen human race. And so you have to, unless you grant that there can be truth in fiction, and so obviously these stories, she's not telling you that you should go out and commit acts of violence. But she is writing stories in a world where there are serial killers and people are murdered and there is malicious gossip and people do think they're better than other people who are of lower income. These are all themes that are pretty big in Flannery O'Connor. And she pulls those into her story. I don't think she does so in an excessive way. Walker Percy does this too. So in other words, Christian writers can't modify, if they're going to write seriously, they're not going to try to modify the world to cater to their audience's sensibilities. They're going to write about the world that we all live in. But that means that they're not going to ignore the good either. I think a lot of non-Christian writers, sometimes, especially realists who write works of realism, make the mistake of ignoring the good. But Christian writers sometimes make the mistake of ignoring the bad or downplaying the
That's
bad.
a good word. So two things here as we come to a close. I can't remember who the poet was, and she wrote this of poetry, but it applies to fiction. It's the little line where she talked about imaginary gardens with real toads in them. And I think that's kind of a fun,
good word,
poetic way to think about fiction, as that it's an imaginary world, but it has real toads. Like, it has real issues and real people and scenarios in them that you can learn and understand and gain some insight into reality, even though it's in an imagined scene. And so I love that poetic little line about imaginary gardens with real toads in them. As we bring this to a conclusion, though, Cameron, so you and I it's interesting for us to have this conversation, because where we draw the lines on what we do and don't put into our minds are very different for us. The line that I've drawn is way, way farther back than 95% of Christians. And you know that, and we laugh about that. And part of that is just discipline on my behalf of what I want in my mind and what I don't. You've drawn that line at a different place. And some of this, I think, maybe comes down to personality, maybe it comes down to how we process visual representations of things, what other things get smuggled into our imagination while we think we're studying one category. So there are, so I can make the case, I think, pretty boldly for the position that I have on some limits that might even seem childish on what I do and don't watch, just for my own sanity and spiritual development. But and then some people look at Cameron and say, well, he's a little, his line's at a different spot. But it's interesting to me that you do have a line. And so there would be a portion of our listenership who I think would be listening from kind of my perspective on some of this. Probably the bell curve fits in between us, but then there's going to be a percentage whose line is farther yet beyond you. And I've run into, in the last little while, a whole host of Christians who really are saying, like, what's the big deal, Cameron, about, and would point to some of the films you've mentioned, or, you even say, Game of Thrones is over the top for me. What would you say to the Christians who have no limit or no line on what they're willing to pursue as entertainment or education or whatever it is that you're doing there? Can you say something? I think you're better qualified to do this, because your line is farther down the track than mine. But since you do have one, what would you caution anybody who is beyond you, maybe, and thinking about where you, I'm not even sure how to categorize that, but I guess a kind of a no limits to say, none of this influences me spiritually. None of this has any impact on my spiritual growth and development. And so the sky's the limit. I have freedom in Christ to do whatever. Where would you go from there?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is there are many people out there who can handle more than I can. And it's worth, I'll state that. Yep. But
I would just say, but can they?
All I can do is give a general.
And I would say, but can they? So, because this is the thing that gets deceitful, I think, is our capacities are often very different than what they think they are. That's the end of my sermon.
All right. Well, here's the thing. Yeah. So there are some who can handle more than me, but if they think if it's somebody who's basically boastfully saying, "Oh, I can handle more than Cameron," then maybe not. If that's the attitude or stance. All I can do is give a principle here, because there isn't a way. In my experience, Nathan, a lot of Christians are looking for a clear rule book on
Mhm.
cultural engagement, or specifically the cultural artifacts that we take in, and there isn't one. So I can't give a legalistic prescription. And a lot of, and some people actually do need those prescriptions, and they are available from certain, there are certain Christian ministries that do give a very detailed breakdown of content of movies and all of that. And that's a service to certain people who need that. And that's fine. Here's what I'd say. Remember, never forget that all of this stuff is never just entertainment. I think that's the key principle. You may be able to handle more than me, fine, but just so long as you don't assume it's neutral, because it is not. Everything you take in is affecting you in some way, and everything you take in is shaping you in some way. It's shaping your sensibilities, it's shaping your expectations of reality. It is indeed influencing you. There, to
You're
me,
being
Nathan,
discipled.
it's not an act. You're being discipled. You're being catechized. It's not an accident, for instance. I think one of the easiest places to point is language. The
Mhm.
general coarsening of language across the board in the United States. There really was a time where my mom, for instance, could say, people just don't talk like that. And that was really true. It is not true
Mhm.
now. And I think
Mhm.
it's undeniable that part of the influence there was undoubtedly movies and now television, especially.
Sure.
So, I mean, if you have a movie like Pulp Fiction, for instance, that came out in 1994, which has, I don't know, 180 F words more or something like that. Yes, that's going to influence, because when we watch those depictions on screen, we can't help but think, well, that's the way things are. That's the way people dress. It's the way people talk. That's the way people have sex. So, not neutral at all, and also not true at all. You are still watching a fantasy. It can have elements of
Mm.
truth in it, but we need to we so there's a careful balance that we have here. So, as long as we recognize that entertainment is not neutral, and that we are spiritual creatures, and that we are getting, even in mass culture, I didn't even talk about that distinction, but it's an important one, because I mean, nowadays, when we think about art, used to be, you know, in times past, Nathan, people, when they were thinking about art, they were thinking about great works of art. Now, if you say, culture and all that, most people just think about pop culture. And there is a difference
Mhm.
between New Girl and Shakespeare. I'm sorry, there is. There's a world of difference. And it's
You're
spelled out
not
in terms of
sorry. It
quality,
makes you
depth,
happy.
beauty.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, it makes me happy. And there's a reason why some stuff that we have sticks around and endures, and other stuff, yeah,
Mhm.
forget it. Most mass culture is in that, you'll forget it one day. It'll be
Yeah.
outdated nowadays, in 5 years it'll be grossly offensive, and any joke that was made could never be repeated again. So, but it's not neutral. You're getting competing visions of the good life. Remember
Yeah, there
that.
you go.
As long as
Mhm.
you bear that in mind, and also never, never, never violate your own conscience. That's the one rule I will give. That's the one prescription I am happy to give. If this is something that troubles you deeply, and I've seen things where we've all had it usually, where I've thought, okay, this is too far for me. I can't do this. You want me to get I can give you a specific example if this helps. Okay, the show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Okay, there's another one. Cameron and his shows. I did start watching It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, and I thought it was hilarious, but my conscience was so troubled, because this show is about wretched, terrible, horrible human beings, and it is a degree of cynicism that is so black and so corrosive to me personally, because I'm predisposed to be cynical. I thought, this is very bad for Cameron McAllister. I will not watch this anymore. And I never have. Okay. So I'm just, there's
Mhm.
I'm trying to give you a specific example that illustrates the general principle I'm making. Don't violate your own conscience. don't forget that it's not neutral.
Yeah, good word. Yeah, thanks for drawing that distinction out there for us. I think that's a good way to bring this conversation to conclusion. Well, there you have it, folks. I don't know if that answered any of the questions that some of you had about the previous episode, but that was our attempt at walling around in those categories again, and it's been good for me, and I hope helpful for you. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.